And I remember looking at the gun, contemplating ending my life, because at that point I felt like I had 3 options, which were kill myself, stay and take the medicine. Well, I guess I only had 2 options. Kill myself or stay and take medicine to feel better, because nothing else seemed possible. Because going on the way I was going, that was not an option for me.
RAE GROSS, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from your home in Venice, California. You are an associate marriage and family therapist working with clients who have experienced religious trauma and other issues. You are also co-host of the FoMo Podcast, a show aimed at ex-Mormons as well as anyone who has survived a high-demand group. Last time on the show, we spoke to Matthew, who had been expelled from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Today, we'll hear you speak out about your own excommunication from the Mormon Church, and we'll see that only groups that can be defined as a cult use this particular kind of shunning to control its members. So how are you doing, Ray? I know you've just moved to a new home with a proper office, so how did it go, and has the new office made a big difference already?
Moving is always a Herculean task, but the payoff has been amazing. And having an office where I can really focus and not be sharing that room with other things it feels like helped me, give better care to my clients.
Well, before we hear about your life before and after your expulsion from the Mormon Church, let's just get a brief overview of this organization. Ray, for anyone who doesn't know, what is the history of the Mormon Church and what do they believe?
There's the history and then there's what they believe. And the last podcast on the left does an incredible 6-part series on the history of the Mormon Church. And it starts with Joseph Smith, who is a charlatan and a treasure hunter, deciding that he has received revelation from God for this new religion that he is going to be starting. And at the time in the United States, there was a huge upswing interest in religion. There were a lot of small, quirky religions being started, and Joseph Smith was a dime a dozen. And the difference is that he was an incredible storyteller, and he would make up what is now known as the Book of Mormon, saying that it was divinely revealed through these golden plates that were given to him by the angel Moroni, and he was translating them using the Urim and Thummim. And what he actually was doing was putting his head inside of a top hat and then allegedly reading what was on the plates, although many speculate that he was just making it up as he went. And he was very charming and very convincing to the point that he amassed thousands of followers before his untimely death when he died at Carthage jail. I don't know what year. So that's the very origins of the Mormon faith. Most people know Mormonism because of polygamy. And Joseph Smith practiced this, some say as a way to get away with cheating on his wife, Emma. And modern day Mormons do not practice the law of polygamy in this lifetime, which most people don't realize. When I meet people, they often ask me how many mothers I have, and they're serious. And my response is, I had one. We're not that kind of Mormon, because there is a kind of Mormon, although they don't call themselves that, the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that do practice polygamy. And this is a radical offshoot that was headed up by Warren Jeff and still is, and he's now in jail for child molestation. So that's modern Mormonism. They don't practice polygamy in this life, which I can explain later if someone's interested. And modern day Mormons, they really try and blend in. They're a huge part of proselytizing. Most young men go on missions at the age of 18 or 19. And the church has slowly evolved to be a little more contemporary every few decades. So for example, up until the late 70s, Black members of the church were not allowed to hold the priesthood or hold leadership roles. And then the prophet revealed that they were now allowed to receive all the rites and rituals that white members were allowed to receive. And that's another thing that distinguishes the Mormon church, is that they are led by what they believe is a modern day prophet, along with his 2 counselors and 12 apostles, much like Jesus. And so they are always getting new inspiration. Recently, they came under fire because they started a new policy that was quickly sunset, that children of gay parents were not allowed to get baptized or receive any of the church rites and rituals or full inclusion in the church. And they have very, I would say, arcane ideas about women. There's the proclamation to the family where the man is supposed to provide, the woman's supposed to stay at home. And, in some ways they've updated their beliefs so they're not really offensive. And then in other ways they are still quite arcane. And I have friends that jokingly say, well, I can't wait until women can get the priesthood or until gay people can be accepted, because they're just waiting for the church to receive their divine revelation. So that's a little bit of history and some of the modern Mormon faith interests.
And it's not too unusual, is it, for a cult leader like Joseph Smith to be charming, but also to be clever, because he was clever, because if he did make up the whole book, not everyone can do that.
Oh, absolutely. And people, especially Mormons, love to discuss how he didn't have anything beyond a 3rd grade education. And that may be true, but that doesn't stop someone from being highly intelligent, highly persuasive, and an incredible storyteller.
Especially if he grew up like apparently he did, being the Bible being read to him by his mother all the time. He had it in it that sort of lingo in his head anyway.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, time to dive into the Mormon world that you grew up in. Now, you were born into this church, the 2nd eldest of 7 children. And although your parents weren't fundamentalist Mormons, they were still pretty devout, wouldn't you say?
They were very devout. My mother was raised Mormon in a family of 7 children as well. And my father was raised a Reformed Jew in Los Angeles. And they met in high school and fell in love. And my father converted to Mormonism after they were married, which is not that common for Mormons to marry non-Mormons, but it did happen. And you would think, with my father being raised a Reformed Jew, that he'd be a little bit more laid back, but he was just as religious as my mother. And my mother, growing up, my friends' parents would all look at my parents and say, whoa, your parents are a little extreme. I'm pretty sure even my mom's siblings look at her and go, wow, you're really taking this to the edge of the meaning. And, a good example is Mormons have this thing called the Word of Wisdom, which is supposed to be a dietary guide, much like the laws of kashrut in Judaism. And there's one passage that says, don't drink hot beverages, which is translated to coffee and caffeinated tea and iced tea. And my mother also then decided to throw in caffeinated sodas, which no one did. Everyone drank Diet Coke and Red Bull and Coke and all those kinds of things. But my parents didn't. They would always just take it 1 degree more. So Mormons aren't supposed to watch R-rated movies. And my parents wouldn't let us watch PG-13 movies. So it was never like insane. Like, we weren't fundamentalist, but we were never allowed to do what even the other Mormons were allowed to do. And my parents took everything very seriously in the church. So we read the scriptures and said the prayers as a family 7 days a week, which you're supposed to do that. But none of my friends' families ever 7 nights a week had the whole family corralled to read the scriptures and say the prayers. And my parents would also do family home evening, which we're commanded to do. Is, I'm going to say we a lot, even though I'm not a Mormon, because there was a time when I was the we. We're commanded to do family home evening, which is every Monday night, the family gets together and you do a prescribed lesson from a book. And aside from the fact that I absolutely hated it, it just took up so much time. And most of my friends' families didn't do family home evening, maybe once a month. And then you had the callings and you had attending church every week. There was no excuse. We didn't go on vacations without going to church. You'd go to a cool place, and Sunday on vacation, you found the local ward and you went to church. There was no breaking the Sabbath day. My parents never shopped on the Sabbath. They didn't even pay for gas. So they were very black and white. This is okay. This is not okay. There was no separating the two. There were almost no instances of ever breaking those agreements, and it was really extreme. And as a result, I found myself being very protective of my siblings, because my parents would come down really hard on all of us children if we weren't meeting their expectations, which, if you've been listening and you have children, you know, following these kinds of rules is not easy for adults, much less children. And I remember as a teenager just finding it really difficult to watch my parents come down so hard on the little ones, knowing that this is not an easy thing to follow through on. You were either in or you were out. My mother used to say, you're either with us or against us. So you knew you were either in the church or you were against her. And there was no place for anything other than total obedience.
Growing up, you were a hardcore believer in Mormon teachings, going to every Mormon event and meeting. But despite this, it really wasn't a perfect fit for you. Isn't that right?
It never felt like it was mine. It felt like it was someone else's beliefs that I was supposed to follow. And in the Mormon faith, they teach you that if you don't feel what you're supposed to feel, it's because you lack faith. So read your scriptures, say your prayers more, fast, and eventually you will feel closeness to God. And for a long time, I just thought I was really broken. I thought that because I hated going to church with a fiery passion, and I hated all the family scriptures and prayers and all the activities, I just thought there was something really wrong with me. And it was a real struggle to come to the understanding, you know, later in life, that I wasn't the broken one, because that's what you're taught from day one. If you don't feel it in your soul, if you don't have the burning in the bosom, then something is wrong with you. And it didn't help that my parents were very conservative and very strict. As I mentioned, there was very little self-expression, and they used the Mormon faith as a way to, you know, really clamp down on us kids. So I was never happy in the faith. There was a lot of guilt. There was a lot of shame. And I remember there were things that I really made up my own mind about. For example, I believed in gay marriage, even as a teenager, and I was pro-choice. And I had these what I didn't realize were progressive political views for Mormons, but were progressive political views because I just had this belief that I couldn't judge anyone else. I felt so judged. I felt so put down by the Mormon faith. I couldn't imagine making someone else feel that bad. And I just figured God would sort it out in the end, and it was none of my business. And all I wanted was to be happy. So all I wanted was for other people to be happy. And that sort of core desire to be happy, I think, is what led me to having this relatively progressive view that I just wanted other people to be happy. And when I would be confronted by any thought of disbelief, my answer to that was, well, I can't prove it's not true, so it must be true. And this is despite the fact that I was on the debate team in high school and college, where the burden of proof is with the affirmative, as they would say, the person that's trying to prove something. That's the burden of proof. But I somehow put the burden of proof on not proving it. And also because the Mormon Church has this very specific line that is, don't consume anything that isn't faith promoting, it's really difficult to justify reading anything that's anti-Mormon Church, because that means that you are exposing yourself to something that could cause doubt. And of course, this is like mid to late 90s when I was a teenager. So yes, I had the internet, but I don't think a lot of the resources were out there for me to even find them. And I really wanted, I think, to be blind to this question. I think it was too scary. I wanted to believe that it was true. And you know, this misery ultimately led me to moving out when I was 17, because I needed to get away from my family, my parents' execution of the Mormon faith. But even then, even with freedom, I moved out. I still went to church every week, even though I hated it still. It was so nonsensical what I was doing at that point.
Well, members of the LDS Church are known to get married quite young. You found yourself married at only 18. from the outset, it wasn't what either of you expected. And in the end, it led to a real epiphany for you. So take us through that time in your life.
So I was in my first year of college, and I had reached this point where I needed to decide if I was going to stay a member. I had started questioning, and again, that thought of, well, if I can't prove it's not true, it must be true, really. And I really took me there, and I decided that I was going to double down on the church. And I went to a church meeting, and I met a guy, and we started dating. And a month later, he asked me to marry him, which was not uncommon. And I prayed about it. And I had prayed many times in the past and had not received what felt like an answer. So when I prayed about marrying him, I felt that I had something that was akin to divine revelation. I heard very distinctly some voice that said, everything will be okay. And that was the first time I felt like I'd ever heard from God. And that was really powerful for me. So I took that as a sign that I was supposed to marry this man. So I said yes. And we were married 3 months later. And I remember on the day of my wedding, I was kneeling across from him, and Mormons kneel at an altar. And the gentleman who was marrying us said, do you do this of your own free will and choice? That's their version of, do you take this man? And I remember hearing in my voice this very loud yell, scream that said no, like loudly. And I then remember saying to myself, this is God's will. And I remember looking around the room, feeling like that moment had taken up seconds, and it probably had taken up a fraction of a second because no one looked upset or confused that I had paused in my answer. And so I said yes, despite the fact that my internal voice had said no very loudly. And we settled into our life together, and he was 21. He was a returned missionary, and we were both in college, and I was on a scholarship for speech and debate. And I had made one caveat before we got married, which was I'm going to finish college and I don't want to have children for 5 years, which would have had me having my first child at 23, which is beyond reasonable in my book. And he's agreed to this. And then very shortly after we got married, he started pressuring me to drop out of college, quit the debate team, and to start having children. And so it was not what I expected. And it was not what he expected. He expected me to make breakfast every morning and do all the household tasks. And despite my parents' many foibles, on this point, they were pretty egalitarian. My father chipped in and helped out. So I didn't understand this domesticated role that this person was expecting me to adhere to. And I was traveling for the debate team. So I was gone, every other weekend because I was competing. This was my scholarship, and he did not like this. And so another year and some change went by, and I had gotten pretty depressed. My friends had suggested that I get on antidepressants, that I was bipolar, that I was, you name it. They wanted me to be on lithium. They wanted me to be on Prozac. Even my mother suggested that I be on an antidepressant. And later she did apologize for that. But I was really in a slump, and I was almost 20. I was also in my senior year of college. I had rapidly finished my degree. And in that week, I had not been able to get out of bed. And here I am about to enter my last semester of college. So it's not like I had a lot of options if I wanted to finish school. And I remember I was sitting in my bed, and I looked across the room into my closet, and there was my gun case. I had a handgun, which was just for target practice. I enjoy marksmanship. And I remember looking at the gun, contemplating ending my life, because at that point I felt like I had 3 options, which were kill myself, stay and take the medicine. Well, I guess I only had 2 options: kill myself or stay and take medicine to feel better. because nothing else seemed possible. Because going on the way I was going, that was not an option for me. So I remember at that moment, I heard a voice, the same voice it felt like that I had heard when I asked about getting married to my husband. And it was very clear. And it said, I don't want to wake up 10 years from now, 3 kids deep in this marriage, hating my life as much as I hate it at this moment. And the thought was so intense. I remember I fell back into my bed and I was looking at the ceiling, and these waves of emotion and thought started rolling over me. And it was, I am so unhappy. I'm so unhappy. I am so unhappy. It was like every iteration and inflection of I'm unhappy, just the words just kept rolling over me. It was like tsunami after tsunami. And I believe it was almost 20 years of unhappiness, blocked out, not allowed. Mormons only have one mood, and that is things are great. And all of my unhappiness came just washing over me. I don't know how long I sat there. And eventually it passed. And I remember thinking, well, I can't go back. I can't unsee what I've seen. I can't unfeel what I have felt. And so there was the next question of, well, what do I do now? And so I think of this as my shelf-breaking moment. And it's not the same as some others where they have put things on a shelf as like things they don't believe in or things they don't want to look at. I put all my emotions on the shelf. And then I think that I just had this internal knowing that I didn't want to die. And that's what broke my shelf. And, I have people when I tell them that I leave the Mormon faith that say, you're so brave for leaving. And I always tell them that's like telling a drowning person that they are brave for trying to find oxygen. I was drowning. I was trying to kick my way to the surface. There was no bravery involved, if I'm totally honest. It was totally and completely just me trying to save my own life.
And would you say that voice that you heard twice, that you don't think it was God? So what do you think it was?
Now, knowing more about intuition and the unconscious, I do think that it was my own internal knowing. I don't know why the phrase "it's going to be okay" was what I heard, but I can say that it was okay in the end. And being married to this man, I really believe pushed me way more quickly toward my shelf break moment. So I'm very grateful to him. And I'm very sorry that I hurt him in my process towards leaving. It was very painful for him. I think it hurt his pride as much as it hurt his feelings, which in the Mormon faith means something. So I genuinely, in retrospect, feel remorse that he was hurt in the process of my leaving the church. But I don't think I would have left in the same time frame, or maybe not at all. Maybe if I'd had a happier marriage, I would have managed to stay in.
Well, after this shelf break moment, you separated from your husband and stayed with a friend. And this is when you found yourself experiencing a kind of identity crisis. Isn't that right?
Identity crisis is a really appropriate description. And what happened was, after I experienced the tsunami of feelings and I knew I couldn't go back, I also didn't know what to do. And I was sitting with this reality for about a month. And I was with one of my best friends in college and her roommate. So they shared a room. And the roommate said something to the effect of, I'm getting married next semester and I'm not going to need this contract. And I don't know if anyone can take it over for my apartment. I can't stay here and I don't want to pay for it. And it felt like someone hit me with a baseball bat. I saw stars for a second. And I remember I blurted out, I'll take it. And the two of them looked at me, and you would think they would have said something like, but you're married and why would you need a place? But they just nodded their heads and said, okay, which in retrospect makes me realize that maybe they realized something was going up. I thought I'd been hiding it really well. So I decided to take the contract, and I wrote her a check from my own personal, bank account. And then I remember waiting a couple of weeks, and I went to my husband at the time, and I told him about the apartment. And I said to him, I can't fix us, until I fix me. And I remember thinking, if he just asks me to stay, I'll stay. And he said the one thing I didn't count on him saying, which was, I think you should move out tonight. And I had nowhere to go. And I was just turned 20.
Literally nowhere to go.
Literally nowhere to go. And he got in our car and drove away. I remember calling the friend and telling her what had just happened. And she told me, pack your stuff. I'll be there in an hour. So I packed my suitcases and my books, and I waited, and she showed up, and I got in her car, and she drove me across town to her apartment, where she lived in a 3-bedroom apartment with a total of 6 women. So there was 2 women to a room. Mm-hmm. And I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor in between the 2 beds. And I took my finals the next week, and I passed my classes, thankfully. And then school let out, and everyone went home. And I didn't have a car. My husband and I at the time shared a car, and my parents lived 6 hours north, and I had a job. So I was alone in this apartment over Christmas break, and I just didn't know what to do with myself. And I remember my still husband, now separated, letting me know that he was going to be heading north, and he was going to go see my family. And mind you, his family did not live up north. So I, to this day, have no idea why he was going up there other than to punish me. And he told me that he was going to tell my parents what I was doing. And I remember begging him to not tell them. I wanted to tell them, and I wanted to do it in person. And he refused. And I asked him several more times, and he kept refusing. And finally, I just said, fine, tell them. And then I waited. I knew when he was going, and I was expecting a phone call from my parents, and they never called. So at that point, I didn't really know what was happening. And mind you, I hadn't left the church yet. I was just ending my marriage. So I don't know what he told them. And I asked my mother and my father years later why they didn't call. And my mother initially said, oh, you'd moved, your number had changed. I was like, Mom, I had a cell phone. My number didn't change. And then she was really honest, and she said, Ray, you were out of sight, out of mind. She had health issues, other kids at home. She had other problems. And I don't know what she thought I would say if she called. So I think she just decided to deal with the stuff that was right in front of her. And when I asked my father, he said, well, you were over 18, you'd moved out, my job was done. So that was my parents' reaction to my leaving the Mormon church. So fast forward a couple of months, and I filed for divorce. And I feel a lot better at this point. I'm no longer depressed. I have lots of energy. I'm feeling really enlivened. And I remember wondering, why did I get married? It was almost like I was coming out of a fog. And I remember thinking, I did it to make other people happy. I remember how much better my parents treated me. Everyone treated me once I got engaged. It was like, oh, Ray's okay now. We don't have to worry about her. She's sorted. And that was really a hard thought, because I'm a really independent person, regardless of my upbringing. And I remember I got out a legal size notebook, yellow, and I got my pen, and I decided to write down everything that I was doing to make other people happy and everything I was doing for me. And so I made a little T, and I labeled them. And on one side, I wrote down, got married, for things I did for other people. And on the other side, I decided that going to college was for me. So I wrote that on that side. And then I thought, why am I Mormon? And I realized it was to make other people happy. So I wrote down being Mormon on the side of things that I did to make other people happy. I wish I still had this piece of paper. I know I wrote down a few more things, but these are the things that I recall. And I decided in that moment that I was going to stop doing the things to make other people happy. And I was never going to do that again. And I can't say I've been perfect in that, but I certainly am aware that I need to do things for me. That's been a powerful North Star since that moment. And then I had to go through and really question what I consider my 10 Commandments moment, which is, the 10 Commandments talk about stealing and adultery. And I sort of went through the 10 Commandments and other Mormon beliefs and thought, am I the kind of person who steals, cheats, lies, has sex, drinks alcohol, does drugs? I never asked. I'd only ever followed the rules I'd been given. And I like to think I made the right choices. I decided that I was not the kind of person who lies, cheats, or steals, very golden rule, but I was the kind of person who had sex and drank alcohol, and drugs were very scary for me at the time, not just because of the Mormon faith, but I grew up in the Reagan era of, this is your brain on drugs. Right. And so I made decisions as much for myself as I could. And that was when I started to gel an identity that was based on my own inner knowing and my own beliefs instead of what I'd been told I should do.
Well, it was in 2002 that you finally left the LDS Church, requesting an official excommunication a year later. Ray, we've talked about the Jehovah's Witnesses practice of disfellowshipping before on this channel, but the Mormons have a very similar practice, correct?
They do. And so I'll talk about the disfellowshipping, and then I'll talk about my excommunication. In Mormonism, if you do certain sins, you are disfellowshipped. Usually these are sins of what they call a sexual nature, because any other sin outside of murder, believe it or not, can be handled between you and God. So you can pray for forgiveness for stealing, lying, and cheating, unless the cheating is adultery, at which point you have to confess your sexual sin and or if you actually commit a murder to your bishop in order to be resolved. So going to your bishop and admitting that you have some kind of sexual sin can lead to disfellowship. And what this looks like is you end up in front of a council of men, priesthood holders, and you confess your sins. And I know people, especially women, if they have had sins of a sexual nature, go in front of multiple men and have to describe in detail their sexual sins. And the falling out is that there is a temporary revocation of your endowments, which are your covenants taken through the temple, and your baptismal covenants. This means that you can't go into the temple. It means you can't hold any calling in the church. It means you can't take the sacrament. It's really obvious when someone gets disfellowed, even if no one talks about it, because it is considered private. People notice when you don't take the sacrament. People notice when you suddenly don't have a calling and aren't doing the ministry work. So it's pretty humiliating, to say the least, to go through this process. And eventually the goal is that you come back to the fold and you are able to be a member. And if you think about this from a psychological standpoint, and as a psychotherapist, this is my place that I go, ostracization and essentially silent treatment is one of the most cruel things you can do to someone. It activates a part of your body that means you're not safe, because we've learned through biological imperatives that it's safe to be in the group and it's not safe to be out of the group. So it's not just, I can't take the sacrament or I can't go to the temple. You're out of the group. And that can be very dysregulating and emotional and traumatizing. I did not go through this process. I will never forget my process towards excommunication. I was at a coffee shop in Salt Lake City on 9th and 9th, and this guy walked in, and I had met him in college down in southern Utah, and he had come out to me as being gay. And I was totally cool with that because, as I mentioned, I was pretty progressive. And then I never saw him again. I don't know where he went. And he walked through that coffee shop door, and he looked at me and said, "RAE GROSS." we started catching up, and he, obviously I'm in a coffee shop, so I'm probably not a good Mormon these days. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you still Mormon?" And I said, "Yes. I mean, I'm not going, but yes." And he goes, "MormonNoMore.com." I said, "Okay." Then he left a few minutes later. I never seen him again. And I visited the website, and they explained my legal rights. And they explained that to get my name removed from my baptismal records was one step, that's the excommunication, but to have any record of me whatsoever removed required a lawyer. So there was some legal information there, but they had a form letter. So I printed the form letter. I think I added maybe a sentence, signed my name to it. And I do not remember how long it took, but sometime in the next 4 to 6 months, I got a letter back from the church that let me know that I was no longer a member of their organization. I think it was 2 sentences long. And when people ask me if I'm still a Mormon or if I'm a Jack Mormon, I like to tell them that I requested my excommunication, which is a little different from just being outright excommunicated because I initiated the process.
And a Jack Mormon is someone who identifies as Mormon but doesn't necessarily go to the services and things.
Yeah, it can be sort of a slur or an insult because the person usually believes in the church or sort of believes in the church, but it's just too hard for them. And so they choose not to go to church. And I really sort of bristle when people tell me or ask me if I'm a Jack Mormon, because no, I don't believe it's true. No, I'm not sitting on the fence. I have made a choice. I have jumped that fence, and I am no longer in that organization.
Well, you're in a much happier place now as a blogger, podcaster, and a therapist. Ray, your previous job had been in marketing. So what is it like to shift into the world of therapy? And do you counsel ex-Mormons like yourself?
I do counsel ex-Mormons in the state of California. So if you are looking for someone like me outside the state of California, I highly recommend you look up the Mormon Mental Health Alliance to find a licensed psychotherapist in your state. And there are a few more in California. You don't have to just call me if you're interested in seeing a mental health professional that shares your background. It's not that different sometimes from becoming a marketer to becoming a psychotherapist, because marketing is a lot of psychology. It's the psychology of getting someone to buy something, and you're trying to shift people's behavior. And I went into marketing because I was fascinated by the human mind. And so this feels like the grown-up version of what I was doing before, because, well, I'll just say it, I'm not a huge fan of capitalism. So selling people things they don't need really lost its shine at some point. And therapy had done a lot for me on my own healing journey. And I just remember there was this moment where marketing really wasn't working for me. And I actually had a dear friend suggest to me that I be a therapist. And it seemed so obvious once they said it. And it has been exactly what I would hoped it would be. I have several former Mormon clients, and I love working with them and being able to speak their language in a way that others can't. And that's not to take away from other therapists, but there is something about that inside baseball, as they say, where you can just cut right through the shorthand and speak about shared experiences, or at least, shared understandings.
And they don't have to explain the terminology to you because you know the terminology.
Right, exactly. And I've also immersed myself in quite a bit of information around high demand groups and cults. It's something that's become of interest to me that was not in the past. For a long time, I just sort of let the Mormon thing fade into the background. And now I've actually started educating myself on that topic. And I do think that people who are leaving high demand groups benefit from either psychotherapy or support groups or coaching, but it's not sounding board that is a reality check for the distortions that are created and then never confronted. I mean, I've had some very weird distortions pop into my mind years after I left the church, and have been amazed at what's still sort of percolating in the background as held beliefs.
Yeah, it's always interesting when, let's say an ex-Jehovah's Witness hears somebody like you talking about your experience, and they'll say, "Oh, that's exactly what happened to me," or "I felt the same way when I was disfellowshipped," or "I didn't know the other groups were shunned." And it's very cathartic, isn't it?
I think so. And I think it's helpful to understand also how they're different, because this is something that is easy to miss if you are sort of leaning towards a high demand group. Sometimes they can be very different. Some of them can be very cruel, and some can come at you with love bombing at first, which is where they just inundate you with how amazing you are to pull you in. And if you've come from a really difficult place. And so it's just good to understand all aspects of high demand groups.
My parents didn't comfort me. My parents told me to read my scriptures and say my prayers. So my entire experience of attachment was extraordinarily disorganized, and this is what I was born into.
You've also just recently started a podcast with fellow therapist Melissa Hennon, the FoMo Podcast, or Former Mormon Podcast. So what inspired you to start this show, and what can people expect from its episodes?
I cannot take credit for the idea of starting the podcast. I had posted into a Facebook group that I served the ex-Mormon community, and another therapist in Los Angeles was actually alerted to my post because she's known as the ex-Mormon therapist. And so she reached out to me, and we started talking and discovered that while we are very different in our approaches and how we left the church, we get along really well. And I think about an hour into the conversation, she said, "Have you ever wanted to do a podcast?" And I said, "I have always wanted to do a podcast." And she asked me if I would like to join her and do a podcast for former Mormons and people that were in high demand groups. So that's how it got started. And, there's a lot of podcasts out there, and there are a number on ex-Mormons and other cults. The thing that we bring to the table that both of us think is different is we bring our psychotherapeutic selves and our analysis. So we look at what is the psychological impact of being in a high demand group. We talk about shared experiences to try and help people understand what happened to them. We share our own personal stories. And then we include in every podcast what we call the path to healing. Because one of the sort of insidious things that Mormonism does is they give you the tool, which is scriptures and prayers, to solve the problem, which doesn't really solve the problem. And so we don't want to just say, "Oh, the Mormon church, it sucks, and here's all the problems it causes," without also giving people hope and a path to healing. So some of the psychological impacts from high demand groups can be disorganized attachment styles, or at least dysregulated attachment style, which means you're not able to form secure bonds with people. There can be boundary violations, so that you do not know how to hold a boundary with anyone. It can cause you to be stressed to the point where your body just starts to break down. I mean, the list goes on and on about what a high demand group can do. It separates you often from the people that you love, or isolates you from the rest of the world. It keeps you from your own inner knowing, which causes depression and anxiety. And one of the things that I experienced was this sense of living to die, where my whole life decisions were made based on my death, how I was going to be judged. And so the ability to be present is virtually impossible. There are so many things that can affect people by being members of a high demand group that can carry over after you leave the group. They don't just get healed because you leave. We recommend a bunch of books. I also recommend the podcast itself. We usually recommend personal psychotherapy and support groups. All of these things are helpful in the path to healing. And one of the most important things is creating a coherent narrative. So this is an aspect of treating someone with PTSD, which is they try and make sense of what happened to them from beginning to end. This is trauma-informed therapy. Because until you can articulate what happened to you, it's basically impossible to find a path to healing. And psychotherapy, and also hearing other people's stories, can help people start to create that coherent narrative.
And it was very interesting. I think it was in your first episode, you decided to tackle that question, is Mormonism a cult? And you looked at Stephen Hassan's BITE model, which actually goes through, is it behavioral control, information control, etc. And it was very interesting what you and Melissa came up with on that episode.
I always struggle with the word cult, because I remember when I left the Mormon church, I really wondered, had I been raised in a cult? And so I Googled, what is a cult? And what I discovered back in 2002 is that there's no technically, academically agreed upon definition of cult, which is true today. And so I've always shied away from the word cult because it's inflammatory and its meaning has changed. There was a time when cult just meant sort of a quirky, as outside group, but not necessarily a high demand group. And, through reading books like Terror, Love, and Brainwashing, and again, brainwashing is questionable because there's not an agreed upon definition of brainwashing or if it's real.
Alexandra Stein, who of course has been on this show many times.
Yes, I love that book. She really talk about helping me create a coherent narrative. I really appreciated that book. And so there's some reclaiming of the word cult for me, much like reclaiming certain words in the LGBTQ community or in the African American community. I use the word cult because I kind of cringe at it and I shy away from it. Even though the Mormon Church meets the definition, I'm trying to be so politically correct. I try and use the word high demand or totalitarian group. But if you use the BITE model, it does meet the definition. And I'm slowly reclaiming that term and identifying the church as a cult.
Ray, it's been such a fascinating journey that you've made, and it's great to see you in such a good place in your life now, helping others who have been through similar experiences to yourself. I will leave links to your therapy, blog, and podcast in the description below. And all that's left to say is thank you very much indeed, Ray, for coming on to Talk Beliefs.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been cathartic in some ways to be able to share this story, which I don't share very often these days. And I want to leave with one parting thought for Mormons, questioning Mormons, and former Mormons, which is this is your journey and your path, and whatever serves you is what I encourage you to do. I'm not here to tell someone that they made the right choice. I'm really here to help people find their highest good. And like I said earlier, to find their path to happiness. That is my highest goal for anyone.